I'm Al McFarland. Welcome to the Marcus Garvey House. Continuing our series of interviews with leaders, elders in our community, we're talking about Black history. Finishing the celebration of Black History Month here, a series brought to you by Comcast of the Twin Cities. We thank them for their support. I'm pleased today to have as an interviewee the Justice Alan Page. Justice Alan Page sought election to the Minnesota Supreme Court in 1992 and won, becoming the first African American on the court and one of the few associate justices ever to join the court, initially through election rather than appointment by the governor. When he was reelected in 1998, he became the biggest vote getter in Minnesota history. He was reelected in 2004 and 2010. He served until he reached the mandatory retirement age of 70 in 2015. Justice Page's deep and abiding belief in the importance of education did not stop with his own success, recognizing a need for our education system to reach more young people of color. He used his 1988 induction into the NFL Hall of Fame to launch the Page Education Foundation with his wife, Diane. Justice Page, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, you know, I ask my guests first what comes to mind when Al McFarland says, think about civil rights. What's the first image, the first thought when you contemplate the civil rights movement?
Well, I grew up a child of the 50s and 60s, and grew up at a time when the movement to end state-sponsored segregation was highly active and making progress. At the time, it seemed like slow progress, but in 1955, I was 10 years old, and Rosa Parks refused to sit down on the bus. So I was there for that. I can recall that happening. When I was 8 years old, the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education. I was around for that. I can remember reading newspaper articles about the court's decision. And so throughout that time period, I was a witness, if you will, to certainly not the beginning of the end, but where things were starting to change. I mean, the reality is that really from the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, people had been struggling and fighting against segregation and had made advancements, but they were slow and few and far between. The pace picked up in the 1950s and 60s.
Due to what?
Well, I think it was due to all the work that got done before. That coupled with, I think, a significant piece of that was the legal strategy which brought about Brown, and which ultimately led to the end of housing discrimination, the end of, at least in a legal sense, the end of racial discrimination, laws which made it illegal. And I can't remember the precise number of years, but roughly 100 years after the 15th Amendment, which ensured voting rights for African Americans, we finally got around to a Voting Rights Act. And so it was the work that all those people did along the way, but particularly the work of Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, and a whole host of people who had a pretty comprehensive legal strategy to turn the law in on itself and change it, and use the law to change, at least in the legal sense, what was acceptable and what was not. Ideally, we would, and we have made progress since then in the actual sense, but obviously we still have a long, long way to go. But without that work and without all that effort over that long time period, we would still be where we were.
Is the work ever at risk? Is progress at risk?
It is absolutely at risk. It's at risk today. It has always been at risk. And I think never more so than now, when we have an administration that seems to be comfortable with bigotry and with and comfortable with allowing others to express their bigotry, and we as a society, as a nation, I mean, people are more comfortable today expressing their bigotry than they have been since I was a child. Mm-hmm. And I thought once we had gotten over that hurdle, we would never go back.
Let me talk about your childhood, Justice Page. Where did you grow up?
Canton, Ohio.
And as a young person, if you could think back to being 4 and 5 years old, what was your family life like, your community life like? I think most of us will remember as small children that our lives were insulated by parents who loved us and cared for us and shielded us from the horrific things happening outside of our view.
I was certainly cared for and loved. And, you know, at that young age, those sort of horrific things that were going on around us, you don't notice so much. Mm-hmm. But certainly I was one of those kids that was cared for and loved, and hoped that as I grew, that my life would be filled with that.
Mm-hmm. What were your parents and your community's expectations of you? How did they see you when you were 5, 10 years old?
My parents, their expectations were high. They drilled in me, my brother, and my 2 sisters the importance of education and the importance of using that as a tool to have a better life than they had. They did not have the opportunity to go to school beyond high school. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to ensure that we had that opportunity, and the only way, as they understood it, and quite frankly as I understand it today, is through being educated. But you know, they were pretty wise in a sense. They, in addition to stressing education, they stressed these aren't their words, mm-hmm. but in essence, this is what I take from it. They stressed seeking excellence. Mm-hmm. Be as good as you can be at what you do. And I can hear them now saying, you know, we don't care what you do when you grow up. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to be a garbage collector, be the best garbage collector you can be.
Mhm.
If you're going to be a doctor, be the best doctor you can be.
That wasn't uncommon.
No.
That really characterized what all of our parents said to all of us all the time.
All the time.
And that was like the narrative that really guided the entire generation, I believe, because everything you said, I have heard said, and everyone I know has the same story. That's exactly what our parents said.
Somewhere along the way, we've lost that. We have not communicated that well to our children.
Okay, it's a challenge. And so your parents had high expectations of you. I asked my guest, Justice Page, about their parents' parents, the sense of genealogy. And I feel that we all carry in us and on our shoulders, and we're on the shoulders of the ancestors that preceded us. Give a sense of lineage or a sense of grands and great-grands?
Well, you know, when I have just the barest of recollections of my grandfather on my father's side. I have no recollection of my grandparents on my mother's side or my grandmother on my father's side. They were gone either before I was born or before I was old enough to sort of connect and recognize.
You think about them?
You know, I'm sort of an odd duck in that sense. I recognize and understand the importance of where we come from, but I focus more on what we're doing now and where we're going.
Okay.
Because I can't sort of control that past. I can remember growing up and hearing people talk about their ancestors and their history. And the only thing I knew about my ancestors in history is that they came over here on slave ships. And maybe I should have been more curious, but I wasn't.
But you're curious now, I know, because you've assembled a phenomenal collection of art.
We have.
that captures the various stages of the African and diasporic experience.
Absolutely.
So how did that happen? How does that happen, and what does it mean to you?
Well, about late 1980s, we lived in this house that was full of contemporary furniture and blank walls and not much art. And a friend stopped by and said, where is the history of your family and, you know, your roots? And Diane took that to heart, and she became an avid collector, starting off with I think the very first thing she bought was a series of Paul Laurence Dunbar poetry books. And from there, our collection expanded to some of the most denigrating objects from the Jim Crow era to a slave-made brick from the original White House, to some of the most beautiful art by and about African Americans that exists.
And so, what does it mean to you, and why is it important that you have?
Well,
these? What does it say to all of us about how we should regard?
It's important on a number of levels, not the least of which is we should never forget the horrific history that we have had as a country, and what one group of people in this country did to another. We should never, ever forget that. We should also never forget and continually be reminded that those of us who have come from the group that was oppressed, we are survivors, and we are creative, we are contributors, we have the skills, abilities, and talents that everybody else has, and we have made a contribution and continue to make a contribution in all aspects of life.
When you begin to develop H5, H10, H12, when did your vision of who you become, how did that develop in you? Were there stages and changes in your expectations of yourself, or were you rifle focused, laser focused from the very beginning on who you've become?
I think in some sense I was hoping to become who I have. I wasn't always laser focused. I wasn't always focused at all. But I had this sense that there was something that I could contribute to mankind, and hoped that somewhere along the way I would figure that out. You know, being a 10-year-old in the 1950s was scary. I mean, the civil rights movement and what was happening to people was scary.
Two things come to mind that you probably reacted to the way I did when you said 10-year-old in the 50s. Two things come to mind. One is ducking under desks in a classroom because of the threat of annihilation, training for the war.
That's true, although, you know, that one didn't bother me. That one,
okay.
That one never sort of resonated with me.
The other thing was Emmett Till. Emmett Till might have happened in the 60s.
No, 1954.
54. Emmett Till's picture on Jet magazine made an impression on everybody.
That was real.
Mm-hmm.
That was the personification of what was happening to African Americans all over the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that was real and palpable.
And so that shaped you in part.
That shaped me. As I said, I think Brown versus the Board of Education shaped me.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me a sense of hope that if the law had the power to change the and equality everywhere.
Mm-hmm. I am hearing this like this, that there is a highway down which oppression was the main product or passenger, and it was sort of a way of life. And your statement suggests that an awareness and awakening on our side told us that this highway is not a one-way street, that what is coming this way can also go that way, but it doesn't have to be the same thing. It doesn't have to be the oppression. It doesn't have to be division and derision. It can be a different product altogether. Does that make sense?
That does. One of the things that over time I sort of figured out is that we as human beings have some ability to direct the future. We have the power within ourselves to bring about change. And the question is, how do you want to bring about that change? What kind of change do you want to see? Is it the kind that results in, you killed my dog, so I'm going to kill your cat and let all your rats run free? Or is it the kind that says, we share this time and this place together, and how do we live together so that I prosper, you prosper, and neither one of us prospers at the other's expense? How do we do that? And my sort of view of the world has always been, how do we figure out how we live together in a way that everybody benefits?
And so that's one of the driving, I think, ideas behind the Page Foundation, is preparing, and that's sort of true to what you said in the beginning.
It's about creating opportunity. Diane and I were fortunate enough to have a lot of good things happen to us in life. And I feel strongly, and she felt strongly, that we had some obligation to help those who are less fortunate than us, to create opportunity for them. And so we came up with the idea of the foundation, which, as you know, provides scholarship support for Minnesota's students of color to go school beyond high school, but also requires our grant recipients, we call them Page Scholars, requires them to work with young children in the area of education, kindergarten through 8th graders, sending to those young children the strong, clear message that education is a tool that they can use to achieve their hopes and dreams. I mean, whatever success I've had, whatever success Diane had, whatever success our children have had, has been tied directly to the educational opportunity that we had. And every child should have that opportunity.
What's your vision for the future, Justice Page? What do you want for the country? What do you want for humanity?
I think we have to, figure out how to live together. We have to stop segregating ourselves. We have to stop dividing ourselves. I mean, clearly we're different. Every one of us is different. But we've got to stop dividing ourselves based on some preconceived notion of some group's inferiority. Do I like everybody that I meet and everybody that's around? No. But I do my best, and I think it has to be a conscious effort to make sure that our feelings about other people are based on what they do, what they say, how they act, and not on some stereotype.
It's the deeds.
Exactly.
What you do.
And I would hope that we could all get there one day. Whether we will or not, who knows? But I don't think we'll get there accidentally. I think we have to work consciously to make it happen.
What of this philosophy guided you in your professional career as an athlete?
I think whether it's on the athletic field or in the law or in our work with the foundation, it's understanding, A, that we have some power, B, that we have to exercise that power, We have to think it through, and then we have to act. And we have to do so consciously. And I think it just sort of permeates who I am and who Diane was.
Justice Page, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful interview. It's so great talking to you.
Thank you.
All right.
Been
I'm Al McFarland. This was Conversations with Al McFarland, my guest, former associate judge for the Minnesota Supreme Court, Alan Page. To experience interviews with civil rights leaders from Minnesota and across the country, visit Comcast's Voices of the Civil Rights Movement platform. It's available for free at civrightsvoices.com. We'll see you next time. Thank you. Great. I think it was a great conversation. Thank you. Thank you.